Hello, I'm Elizabeth Heathfield, the Chief Communications Officer at FS-ISAC, and this is FinCyber Today, the podcast. FS-ISAC's mission is to advance cybersecurity and resiliency of the global financial system. On this podcast, we'll talk to leaders from across the sector around the world about the most pressing issues in cybersecurity they see today and where they see the future going. Our guest today is Teresa Walsh, FS-ISAC's Global Head of Intelligence. Teresa began her career as an intelligence analyst in the U.S. Navy, the actual NCIS, before moving on to the private sector, working in security for JP Morgan and Citi. Now she runs FS-ISAC's Global Intelligence Office, a follow-the-sun operation with intel analysts around the world who collate the intelligence submitted by our members, enrich it, and then distribute back out to the membership in various forms. Teresa, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Let's start with your experience. What's the biggest difference between the public and private sectors in terms of how they think about and handle intelligence?
I think the biggest difference is how much time each has had to develop the intelligence profession. In the private sector, it's still fairly new, whereas governments have been doing this for decades, if not centuries, in some cases, and they've been able to really develop it beyond the tactical level of what's happening every day and putting that into their knowledge of how to move forward with policies and major decisions in terms of budget or investments or what you're going to do next for the next 5 to 10 years. We're not there yet with the private sector. We're still kind of creeping forward. And, if you go to a lot of conferences, they're still talking about IOCs, indicators of compromise, rather than the big ticket questions of where this is going for us as a sector. So we still have a way to go, and unfortunately, in the private sector.
So what do you think we in the private sector could really be learning specifically from the way the public sector does intelligence?
One thing that I have tried to champion myself is strategic intelligence analysis. So analysis is a profession. It's not just, something that happens to be there every once in a while. There's tools, there's form, there's a process to it. And I think that's where we need to go. You can't just suddenly look at one of your staff members and say, congratulations, you're an intel analyst. You do actually need to train them up and get them to the point where they're actually looking at your business as a whole and how to protect it long term. So it shouldn't just be what is the IP address or URL that you're going to block that day from your SOC. It should be about learning what are the primary threats that are affecting you realistically, and then trying to do something about it to make your company and your customers more resilient to those types of attacks.
How do you train intel analysts on the business side of the equation so that they actually know, what they're seeing could actually impact the business, especially young and more inexperienced analysts?
It's a great question, because one of the things I used to joke about when I used to work for banks is, you have to almost remind yourself that you do work for a bank. You're not a technology company, you're not a cybersecurity vendor, you're not a threat intel vendor. You are doing this for a purpose of your company. If it is a financial institution, there's a lot of business going on behind the scenes that you were never trained on. Most of us are not economics majors and finance majors. We're not professional traders. We're not bankers. We're cyber people. So we do have to understand what the business does and then try to figure out how to protect that business and how they're evolving themselves, because you're talking to professionals who are looking at challenges in the marketplace, trying to invest in different places, mergers and acquisitions. It's an incredibly different world from us, but you're the one who's expected to protect it. So you have to understand it in some case. And I can definitely say from personal experience, I didn't have that background in finance or economics, and suddenly working for the financial community, I had to understand how payments work. How do international transactions happen? What are wholesale settlements? And all that world, to understand then how my company fits into that bigger picture And then how can I protect that? What are the threats I need to actually look out for? If you're just looking at cyber threats in a vacuum, you're probably not going to be helping your company specifically. So you really need to try to apply what you're doing to your company's environment.
Given how sophisticated and well resourced the financial sector is, both technologically and in terms of generally realizing return on investment, what do you think the holdup is in terms of why we as a sector haven't yet fully been able to capitalize on the value of threat intelligence?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I really do think it's multifaceted in nature. It's a little bit of everything. Probably some of it is that we, and as security people, have been seen as a cost center for the most part. And when you're trying to develop the latest crazy app that everybody's going to love, or the latest product, you don't necessarily think of security first. And sometimes security can be seen as a hindrance to that innovation because suddenly they came in and say, time out, guys, you need to rethink how you're doing this. And I think that's why you are seeing much more of a drive to start talking to security people and threat people like myself early on, before you even start coding anything out, to understand exactly what that picture is, what that environment is. So you have that as a developer in the back of your mind while you're trying to create the next best thing. And then if you can try to start changing the mindset that we're not a cost center, we're not inhibiting your innovation as a business, that we can actually benefit from it. I think that will gradually increase over time, and people will see that they're actually stronger for understanding the threat horizon and understanding how to keep their products and their customers safe so they don't end up in the media cited as the next attack. And I think, there is also a lot to say about the languages we speak. We speak cyber language to each other, and if you're talking to a fraud person or if you're talking to a finance person, they might not know anything what you're talking about. And I think sometimes, since we live in that language, we take for granted that people know what we're talking about. So, I always try to, joke that I'm channeling my inner Jerry Maguire, that I have to, help them help themselves, and really try to understand where they're coming from, what motivates them, what are they looking for, and then I have to be the one to adapt my work so they can use it, they can understand it, and they can make a better product at the end of the day.
Hmm. I would think that, I mean, from where I sit in communications, cybersecurity is becoming such a mainstream topic. It's in not just consumers, but obviously at level, board level and executive level. And what are you seeing in terms of the role of the CISO? Is that CISO now becoming more of a business function versus what I think in the past was much more of a technical function, usually sitting, under the CTO or CIO, and now it's CISOs are being elevated to board level, sitting on boards and things like that. Are you seeing that in the, I see that in the kind of news landscape. Are you seeing that in the real, what's actually happening at financial institutions? CISOs are becoming more prominent and also therefore having to be more business focused?
I think there's no one size fits all. Unfortunately, I mean, our own members are all different shapes and sizes, all different ways of doing business. I think you do definitely see a trend of the CISOs having much more of an elevated role within their companies. We've seen lots of examples of that where, some CISOs have gone on to run parts of the business. Some CISOs are sitting down with the board of directors. Some CISOs are no longer reporting to somebody else; they're reporting directly to the CEO. Even in the Intel world, there's been talk now about a chief intelligence officer, and how
Mm.
that might need to be separate from security as well. So I think those types of conversations will always continue. And again, the one size fits all will probably never exist. It's probably what's best for your company at the end of the day. But I do see now more of an awareness where CISOs or intel officers, whatever you want to call them, they are starting to have this understanding that they are part of a company. It's not just them having to deal with the technology. They have to learn how to communicate to their board who doesn't know anything about cyber. They need to communicate to their CEO who's looking at the budgets and asking what happened to our profits and all those business type questions that are typical in those worlds. And so I think you do have much more of a realization where we have some really great examples, especially in our sector, of some savvy CISOs who really understand their businesses and understand where they fit in the world. And I think that's where we do need to progress. And I know there are some CISO classes out there nowadays, but it
Mm.
would be great, to show how our CISOs, especially, because those are the ones I see firsthand, but how they are integrating with their companies more and more, and that you want to be able to say that your business person looked for you and asked you some questions because they were thinking about a new strategy for the business, because they want to involve you. They want you to be part of that solution rather than somebody you have to check in with once you get to a certain point. And I do see that. Whether or not that's going to be wholesale across every single company you come across, probably not, especially the smaller companies who, you have lots of people wearing different hats. But I think especially for the bigger companies, you are seeing great strides of the growth of the CISO.
I would think that there's a danger that, as you said, if information security has to be able to speak the language of the business in order for the business to maximize the value and see the value of threat intel more than just the cost center and cybersecurity in general, um, that there's a danger if the CISO is too technical and not business savvy enough that they won't get the resources that they need, because they can't speak the language and they can't articulate the return on investment. I know it's famously difficult to quantify security investment ROI, but seems like that's something that needs to happen. I don't know, if you're seeing that as well, if you would agree with that. Needs to be able to
Well,
quantify the investment that's made.
it- and that's an age-old question, isn't it? How do you determine KPIs? How do you determine success? How do you measure that success? And you can talk about different types of HR type of best practices, like the SMART acronym of specific and measurable and things like that. And that's great in some sense, but it's hard. I've seen people measure cybersecurity in terms of how many IOCs they blocked that month. Is that an actual measure of success or not? And I think a lot of people are kind of moving away from the traditional measurements, of counting IOCs and things like that, or counting investigations, and moving more to what in intelligence terms we characterize as the so what. What does this actually mean for the company? What did you do this month that actually has impact to the company at that point?
So speaking of that, I know you're writing a journal article. You've written a journal article, that's going to be published about the strategic value of threat intelligence. Talk a little bit about how you see threat intelligence being utilized beyond just the cybersecurity function.
Yeah, it was something that I had been thinking about for a long time. Even when I was in the government side of things, I did look at how different analysts can have pieces of the puzzle, basically. I'm a parent, so I use the Lego analogy quite a few times, when I'm speaking to people. But, we're all responsible for different pieces, and they build a bigger picture, basically, because not one person can do everything. The greatest analyst in the world can't do everything by herself. And so you do need to work together. There are people who are going to focus on just the tactical. There are going to be people who focus on malware. There are people who focus on DDoS attacks. There are people who focus on threat actors, infrastructure. And you have those types of specialties that are out there. And when you bring that all together, that creates a bigger picture. But you also need to, once again, apply that to the business that you work for. And sometimes, that can happen at the technical side where you say this control needs to be improved or maybe implemented in order to protect against a specific type of attack. But a lot of times, especially when you're thinking about long term or significant strategic steps that the company needs to take, you need to take a step back from the tactical, technical world. You need to look at the classic who, what, when, where, why, and address how your company is progressing in the state of current threats or current technology advances, and how, as technology advances, you're always going to have vulnerabilities. You're always going to have to address those vulnerabilities and chase after them before the bad guys get a hold of them. And so you do need that sense of stepping back away from just that technical infrastructure IOC world and be able to say, what does this actually mean for the company? Where is this going and how can we apply it? And that's where you get to the more strategic side of things. In the government sense, especially in the United States, we produce national intelligence estimates that come out, and policymakers can use that to do their long-term planning, to do major decisions in terms of what are your priorities, where are you investing people, where are you investing assets in, and they use that intelligence to help shape their decisions in terms of policy. We don't do that today in the private sector sense. So that's where we need to step towards a strategic intelligence to help your CEO, help your other chief executives that are sitting on your board of directors or at that strategic meeting that your company's having to talk about the latest business. And they need to be able to be armed with that information to make the right choices, to make sure that how they're progressing as a business is also keeping security in mind to protect their customers and be more resilient to the very prevalent attacks that are out there these days.
So let's talk a little bit about resilience, because I think, it's obviously it's more than a buzzword, right? It's like a movement, right? To be thinking not just in terms of protecting, but in terms of, being able to keep operating no matter what. How does threat intelligence directly inform or improve resilience?
So it helps you prioritize, for one. If you are blessed with an unlimited budget, that is fabulous for you, but most people are not. Most companies have to prioritize. They only have a certain number of people, they only have a certain amount that they can invest in new technologies, and they need to understand what is the most realistic thing that could happen to them and how do they prepare for that. And intelligence can bring that along for them to help make their job easier of what should you be looking at. There are value in looking at black swan events, as they call them, the once in a lifetime types of situations. A global pandemic was considered a black swan event. Everybody thought that it was, in this day and age with the medicine and technology the way it was, that it would never happen. There was a global pandemic exercise years ago where I think
Yeah.
there were comments of, why are we doing this exercise? What use is it? You do need to do those black swan events to just test it out. But, on a regular basis, you should be looking at things that are very realistic and feasible, that could happen to your company, that could happen to your customers. Phishing attacks, scams, social engineering. Those are things that happen every single day, and you need to make sure that your company's aware of it. Is your finance team knowledgeable about business email compromise attacks? Do they know who to call if they suddenly get a text message from somebody claiming to be your CEO saying he needs money fast? And those are the types of things that are very realistic. Probably high probability that it's going to happen to your company at some point. You can do simple tabletop exercises. You can build communications plans, response plans, work with your communications teams like yourselves on how do you respond if something does happen and you need to put out a notice to your customers. But those are things that can really help prepare you for the high probability events. And don't dismiss the black swan events, because we're just coming out of one ourselves. But at the
Mhm.
same time, use the intelligence to help you prioritize what you invest in.
Great. All right. Well, speaking of all that, let's talk about the current threat landscape. Given that's your bread and butter, a lot of the things you were just talking about seem like well, I don't know. They seem to me now like they're a bit old hat, like they're kind of mundane and everyday. Are these the things that executives at financial institutions really need to be thinking about? And what are the other kind of big ticket threats that are out there that, not just security teams and CISOs, but also executives and boards need to understand?
So it can seem mundane, but usually it's the everyday type of threats that ends up getting you, unfortunately. And that's why we can't ignore the mundane ones, the ones that have been around forever, because the reason they've been around forever is because they've worked. And so it's really easy to try to trick somebody into clicking onto something, or sending money if you're successful at tricking them about who you are. And that said, there are a lot of new attacks out there. Ransomware has really risen in the past 5 years, especially. There's now more visibility, at least, on supply chain attacks, about how third parties are getting targeted by some of these actors, whether they're ransomware or other types of actors, to shut them down. And I think we've focused so much on our own house, basically, to make our house as strong and secure as possible, that you forgot about your neighbor's house, and you forgot about what could impact you, or that you're at the bottom of a valley of a flood terrain or something, that there are all these factors around you. Not to make you paranoid, but there are all these factors around you that could impact you and that could have harm to you and your company. So I think there is more awareness of that, thanks to some of the bigger attacks we've had in this previous years, like solar winds, especially. I think it was one of those classic examples of a company most people had never even heard of having a huge impact to companies once thought to be, indestructible, basically, that there was no way to compromise them. So, it was an eye opener that you can't just think about your own house, your own infrastructure, that you do have to understand where you're connected to, your supply chain. Do you have internet coming into your company's building? Is there a danger that that internet might go away, as they saw in Canada a couple months ago, where suddenly there was no internet and their companies couldn't do business? ATMs are connected to the internet, so imagine if your customers can't get access to their money, and different things like that. Energy, for instance, we all need electricity running. Eventually your generators will give out if you don't have electricity. So you need to understand where your dependencies are. And I think that's where a lot of these companies are moving towards. I think they were always very focused on their own company security, their own company's success, but now they have to worry about everybody else at this point too.
How do you even begin to do that? I mean,
Well,
the
I think,
supply chain
yeah.
is so big, right? Like the digitization of financial services is such that there are suppliers for everything, right? Because things have moved so quickly that there's just no internal capacity to build all of the services that are needed by a financial services firm, right? To serve their customers. So there's so much third party, third, fourth, fifth party suppliers. I mean, I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole because I think we could have a whole episode just on this, right? But um, how do you even begin to think about how to manage this cybersecurity risk of your supply chain?
Well, for me, that was one of the reasons I moved from the banking side of the house to actually being part of FS-ISAC, because I did see how you could use a community to your advantage in that way. If I had a question, I would just go to FS-ISAC and ask the question. Has anybody else faced this? Has anybody else dealt with this? It would save me time. It would save me a lot of resources that I would have to invest in if somebody else just like me had the answer already. And that's where I see a lot of the third party and supply chain conversations going as well, because in the end of the day we have a lot of the same third parties, and those third parties have a lot of the same fourth parties. And so I think we do see that people do realize that, if you know that at least 10 other companies use the exact same third party as you do, why wouldn't you talk to them? And I think in some ways too, that third party, it's a little bit easier on them. Instead of having 100 different conversations with companies about the same thing, they can use the power of the community of an ISAC to, hit more than one to many, as they say. So you can have that type of community conversation with it. And I think in that sense, it's almost essential. There are some companies that do have a lot of personnel. They have maybe entire teams devoted just to third party risk. But again, most companies don't have those types of investments of huge third party risk programs where they have at the tip of their fingers an exact list of all their assets, exact list of all their API connections. That's something I think we all dream about, but it's probably not realistic for most companies. So in that sense, you do have to kind of pool together your knowledge. You have to act as a community. We've seen it now with different types of data breaches or compromises, or even just a rumor of a compromise, that if something happens, the community does react to it because,
Mm.
again, they know that in certain countries, there's only a certain number of ISPs. There's only a certain number of energy companies. There might be only a couple of IT service providers or accounting software providers, as we saw with the NotPetya attacks, where one of the companies, one of the third-party providers, their software update infected, I think it was 90% of the country. So it was, I think you do have those situations, and it's best then that as a community we try to step forward of how to work with those third parties. And that's why, with FS-ISAC, we built the critical providers program, because it was a recognition that these companies are not financial institutions like our members are, but they're part of the way we secure our companies and secure our customers. So they have to be part of the conversation. And I think, those are the steps you see now around the world, where a lot of financial regulators are starting to understand that there are companies out there that are integral to the entire sector for their countries, and they need to be part of that conversation. And they're looking at labeling them as critical, or even regulating them underneath the financial regulator now. So I think this is definitely the time to have that community in place to address these issues.
Do you think that the community conversation, such as like what we do at FS-ISAC, is the only way, or is at least a core way that security teams can stay ahead of threat actors? I mean, they have unlimited resources. I mean, they have some level of resources, right? Constraints, but really, when you think about them in total, they're sort of unlimited, anomalous, and certainly innovative and highly sophisticated. I mean, in some ways, you would think that given our resource constraints, we would have seen a lot more serious attacks now than we have. So what do you think the best way? Are we staying ahead of the threats? And what do you think the best ways, the best tools that we have at our disposal to keep doing that?
I think the financial sector, out of all the other private sectors, is probably far ahead of the curve. And, even that said, we are still targeted on a daily basis. We are still seeing attacks. You do see like the ransomware leak sites, list a financial institution, I think pretty much almost every week at some point. So, we are still targeted. There are successful attacks. I guess maybe the degree of success for the sector at large is, maybe up for debate, and that makes it seem like maybe the threat isn't as real. But I think whenever you do go to other sectors, like the water sector, for instance, that had some very major, almost catastrophic attacks happen to them, that's where you start to see, I think, the more prevalence of these types of cyber actors and cyber tools at large. And I think, maybe sometimes we're a little bit a victim of our own success in the financial sector, because we have devoted so much time, so much money into protecting ourselves, that now we kind of maybe are getting a little bit too relaxed because of it. And I think we always do need to get on top of it, but that's where community can play a role as well, because in the US there's the National Council of ISACs, for instance. Europe is starting to build an ISAC community, and we can start to learn from each other and really try to bring some of those best practices to each other as well, and realize that there are those dependencies, because even though your company doesn't eat or drive, your people do, your staff do. They're commuting in, maybe driving in, so the roads need to be clear, or maybe the trains need to be working and people not on strike, things like that, where
I
you
know
have to
about that.
depend. Yeah, you have all these dependencies that you've never realized about. And the next natural disaster could mean half your staff can't come into the office. So I think those types of things we need to learn from each other, not just for security but also resilience at that point too. Is how do you work from home, with 100% of your work staff working from home? How do you do those things? And we saw that at the beginning of the pandemic, didn't we? That our communication channels skyrocketed because everybody suddenly was in this unknown place and they needed to help each other out. And you saw a lot of people saying, help. What are you doing with this? How are you handling data loss protection? How are you handling corporate devices and corporate phones, and people having to homeschool their kids on maybe a corporate laptop, and things like that. So
Mhm.
I think that's where the community does come into play. Is sometimes there are these issues that you know you could try to do it yourself, and there are some companies that do have almost unlimited resources to invest in an army of people to do it themselves. But if you don't have to, why would you? And isn't it great to just kind of be able to talk to other companies that are just like you? You can decide to talk to companies in your industry, you can talk to companies in your geographic region, and you can kind of get an idea of what they're doing and benchmark yourself and really be able to say, yeah, am I doing something that nobody else is doing and I can teach them? Or vice versa, is somebody doing something really interesting and I can learn from that and do it? I mean, it's almost like a Pinterest for cybersecurity, isn't it? What is everybody else doing and how can I do it myself? And really trying to go down that route. So obviously I'm biased, and I find a lot of value with the community, but I really do think that a lot of people can get a lot from their designated ISAC, or even if you don't have an ISAC in your country, start talking to your peers and get together and start talking about the issues that you all have in common.
Hmm. So one issue that comes to mind that everybody's talking about is the great cybersecurity talent shortage. And we've talked about this a lot. It's certainly an issue that I think our members care about, and have, with varying success, tried to build funnels and pipelines of talent. Do you see it in reality that the talent shortage is as bad as everybody's talking about? There's that study out there that says that there's 1 million cybersecurity jobs that need to be filled. Is that real? And if it was real, I mean, you would think that if we were so vastly, terribly understaffed, that we would probably have a lot more successful attacks than we do.
Yeah, and I don't want to say it's not real because obviously there are a lot of companies trying to recruit and not finding people. But at the same time, I think again it's a multifaceted answer. Are you using the people that you have effectively to cover the bases? Are you using your community? Because I've heard some people say, "Oh, this it's such a big job. I don't know how I can keep up." And that's why I always say, just ask people who are like you and looking at the same things because I know when I worked for the banks, it was so much easier. Just, if I was saying, looking at a threat actor or, an attack pattern and saying, I need investigate this and I need to look further into it. Of course, I'm the only one who has access to my company. But if I know somebody from a different company is looking at the same threat, there's a lot that you can share back and forth without ever having to get into your internal systems.
Mm.
And it just saves so much time. And so part of me just wonders, why wouldn't you try to save time and work with your peers for that? And so I do sometimes wonder, if it is an efficient use of your personnel. Are you trying to bite off more than you can chew? Are you trying to do everything yourself? If you're a very small company, does it make sense for you to have a threat hunting team, a red team, a penetration testing team, a vulnerability management team, and everything that comes into the kit of cyber defense, basically? So you do have to understand what you can do in-house, what you need to outsource, and what you need to maybe be more collaborative with your peers about, so you can again kind of crowdsource that information. I once saw a company where multiple different um, departments and teams had their own intelligence analysts, and they didn't work together. They actually sometimes didn't even know each other existed, and it was because that they felt that they weren't getting enough out of the one intel team that existed in the company. So everybody wanted intel, so they just decided just to all hire their own teams. And so that, I find is, profound lack of efficiency, because why would you have three different analysts around the company looking at the exact same thing and doing the exact same work? The redundancy is great in some aspects, but in other aspects it might be a bit wasteful. But I think you do need to probably take a little bit of a deeper look at the cyber talent pool. Are you adapting to the current world? I mean, the pandemic has shown that you can work from home. I'm sat here right now working from home. So, do you actually need people to go in 5 days a week? Do can you take advantage of some of that remote work to get the talent into your company and really try to adapt to this talent? And now you have people who at this point have graduated from university and have always worked from home. Are they going to suddenly change their mind and go to a 5 day a week job? But I think you also need to understand that it is hard to find that purple unicorn that is going to be exactly what you need. So you might need to hire somebody who's almost to that point, but you're going to have to train. You're going to have to mentor. You're going to have to give them that few years of growth where you can use their talents, but at the same time invest in them, so they don't just turn around and leave your company. But so I think it's a much bigger problem. I've had my own share of trying to hire people and you know getting caught up with not being able to find the right one, or maybe being overshadowed by competitors that are offering them much more salary, and you're trying to figure things out. But I think a lot of the programs that I see, internships, apprenticeships, scholarships to students, here in the UK where I live, there's actually a program that the government runs to target young girls, to teach them how to code and how to embrace the world of cyber as well. And I do think you need to start young, but I mean, if I had done what I thought I was going to do at the age of 7, I'd be an astronaut right now. But you need to be able to give people, young people, different options, and it can't just be doctor, lawyer,
Yeah.
ballerina. It has to, it has to be different types of options, because by the time they're 16, they've probably made up their minds in general of where they want to go. And so you do need to have those types of programs if you want to build your cyber program.
So, what are some promising career paths if you're a young person who's interested in the world of cybersecurity? What are some kind of career paths that you think are in need, right? That really do, or like really are understaffed, or at least have a lot of potential for growth in the future.
When I interview young candidates and I ask them where they want to focus in, almost all of them say penetration testing. And it's usually because they've had those capture the flag type lessons or challenges, and it's been exciting for them. And obviously, penetration testing is important, but not the only thing out there. And so I do think we need to, sometimes kind of push people into areas like cyber intel analysis, or cyber crime specialties, for instance, where you're looking at the crimes against your customers, but also just in general, like even working in a SOC. Sometimes I think people will say, as candidates will say to me, "Oh, I've worked in a SOC for a few years, and I want to just try something different." It's not exciting for them, and so I think we do need to kind of maybe take a look at how we are introducing different types of roles for young people. And it's not going to be Hollywood. You're not going to be, typing to save somebody's life in
Says the
30
woman
seconds or
who was at
less.
NCIS.
But yeah, yes, a
Could be
very
kind
classic
of
example.
Hollywood.
A classic example where Hollywood and reality doesn't always mesh. But I think you have a lot of expectations sometimes of having to be at the edge of your seat, and being called into the prime minister's office, and having to explain this cyber situation to them when you're only 21 years old, and things like that. And we do have to kind of, I think, show them the different paths. If they want to be programmers, what can they do in the programming world? It's not just about being a developer. They can actually create programs for cybersecurity as well, and scripting things out. We work with lots of big databases all the time, and just trying to show them a little bit of everything. There are some banks that I know that have these wonderful programs where you do rotations for interns in different departments, so they get a little bit of a taste of everything. And I know other departments do that. For instance, the London School of Economics has like a taster session if you want to try to figure out what you want to do in economics. And so they show you different aspects of it, to show you what you could be doing. And I think we need to probably do a better job at that, because like I said, it's probably 99% of the students that I interview that they all want to be penetration testers one day. So we do have a long road to show that it's not just about a capture the flag lifestyle, but there's a lot of other things out there. And
Being a
really,
hacker is sexy, even if you
exactly.
just want to be the good guy.
Yeah, and really, once you get into a business, you can explore other areas. Like I said, we've seen CISOs who have gone on to run entire businesses. So you don't actually have to stay in your cybersecurity world for the rest of your life. You can use it as a stepping stone to explore other things.
Why do you think so few women have gone into cybersecurity? Is it typical, or and is that even true? I mean, I hear that it's true, and I see from the participation of our membership that it seems to be primarily men. But obviously, it didn't stop you and many of the other women leaders that we have at FS-ISAC and on our board. But is it the classic, like, women don't do tech thing, that because it's not tech specifically, why do you think there is this lack of women in the field, or at least certainly it's not 50-50?
Yeah, and it's not 50-50 yet, but it has changed. When I first started in the cyber world, I used to joke that the line to the bathroom was a lot shorter than it used to be. And so, I didn't have to worry about that. I could go to a conference and literally just count in the crowd how many women there were. And now it's different. Now I do see a lot more women at conferences and meetings that I go to. And that is really refreshing, not just in terms of, gender solidarity, but also just in terms of general diversity, because I think teams and companies are actually stronger when they have different experiences, different voices, different people contributing to it as well. Why they haven't really kind of gone towards cybersecurity? Well, first of all, it's a newer type of thing, but I think also, again, probably a multifaceted thing where we didn't teach young girls at the beginning to do computer science. We didn't push them for things like that. I learned basic way back when, which is now showing my age. But being able to learn programming languages, is not sexy. It's not. It's not.
It
It's
is
not
now.
something. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Silicon
Especially.
Valley.
Yeah,
It is
exactly.
Hollywood now.
Yeah. Well, growing up in the 80s in the Midwest,
Yeah.
especially, those types of things, we're not considered, the up and coming um, professions for women. And so I think there's a lot of things that we had to combat, cultural sensitivities. Women still do a lot of the housework. I do now see stay-at-home dads, which is awesome. And I think, seeing, that type of diversification with the family structure is fantastic. But you do see actually still, and not just in our field, but in other fields as well. When I first started with the government, I was also not, one of the only women in the crowd too,
Hmm.
especially working in the military. The military is dominated by men, and
Well, that's what I
mili-
was going to say. Is cybersecurity kind of, in some ways, I wonder if there's this extension where people like, there's the tech side of it, which is already, we sort of know that story. But then there's also this kind of military feel to it, right? It's us versus them. There's a protection element. You're a defense force. And I wonder if that is also a reason why it doesn't attract as many women. But I think that potentially this intelligence side of things, research and looking for patterns and this kind of, if this aspect was promoted more, it could be something that does naturally attract more women. I don't know if you agree.
I would agree actually, because there was something interesting that I read that most of the audience for true crime podcasts and true crime novels is overwhelmingly women. And I think that's because, they want to solve the puzzle. They want to find out who done it. And I think, sometimes we do tend to be natural problem solvers and natural puzzle solvers as well. And what is cyber intelligence but that, really? And so I think if you kind of reframe it into those concepts, that, I am always trying to pull the thread and find out more. But why did it do this? But why am I seeing this? And where did this come from? And is it anywhere else? That type of natural curiosity, really is part of me. But when I see something like that, I was a crazy amount. I should have looked it up before then, before this. But overwhelmingly, the audience is true for true crime podcasts is women. It's because they're trying to solve the puzzles.
Mm.
And I think you do need to kind of embrace that inclination and show how you can use it in fields like ours. And they probably would never have thought of it in that sense. But I mean, they used to say when I was in the government that being an analyst is much more like Sherlock Holmes than James Bond. You're not out there running around and doing parkour in Nigeria. You're sitting in front of your computer looking up data, trying to do link analysis, trying to do research, doing, you know, basically pecking at the dust for answers, and that's really the type of mindset where analysis makes a difference, I think.
Mm. So, for the true crime lovers out there, can you tell a story or give us an example of one of those times? Obviously, something that's not TLP red, but of one of those times where you really had to solve the puzzle, or not even necessarily you, but as a collective, we had to solve the puzzle, and kind of like the payoff of that, of when you actually do figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it is a series of challenges basically that you go into this field. But I think always at the beginning of a new role, I always kind of have to almost kind of assert why I exist. Why does my role exist? And so that's always like the biggest hurdle. But when you have that one shining moment where you can show your boss and the people who own the budget and people like that, why they hired you in the first place. That's a lovely example, and it makes you feel very proud. There was a time that we were getting threat intelligence from a company, and it was very interesting, but some people ask the question, well, what can we do with this? And beyond the tactical sense, what can we just, we see something, we say, okay, let's remediate, and that's it. And so I started kind of looking at the data and then trying to match it with our internal data that we had. And it was a threat actor going after our customers. And for us, we don't have access to our customers' computers, so we can only see what certain amounts of information in the customer transaction logs. And piecing together, I think it was 5 different databases and the threat intel provider's information, I probably spent over 100 hours trying to piece the puzzle together. I probably went overboard, to be honest, but it was just so interesting. And again, that who done it type of mentality of trying to keep on digging, that I eventually was able to identify the threat actor, not just by the moniker that the person used, but the actual real life person who
Wow.
was doing this crime against our customers. And we're seeing it from the cyber intel sense. We're letting our businesses know which customers are being impacted, but even they didn't understand how vast the network was. And it turned out to be one guy actually kind of doing this on his off time. But it was one of those very satisfying moments where it was the classic kind of Clue, or Cluedo if you're British, moment of it's Colonel Mustard with the lead pipe in the library, and I had that entire package. Now things always don't always turn out that way, but I always tell people that, if you have skeptics who are questioning why you're there, why we hired somebody of your position there, you do almost have to chase them down with really great information that makes them look good. And if you can show that you've saved them money, you've you know given them investigator of the year status or something like that, they are going to think from now on that the intelligence that you give them is gold. And suddenly they'll be converts, and they'll look to you and say, hey Teresa, I'm looking at this, can you take a look? And it's those types of initial success stories that sometimes can be the hardest, because once you get the ball rolling and you have that collaboration and gear, it's a lovely, wonderful working experience, working with your business teams and fraud teams and other teams around your company. But you have to first cross that first threshold to show the success in the the face of a whole bunch of skepticism. So that can be the hardest thing you ever have to do in a company.
Interesting. So, what's keeping you awake at night right now in the threat landscape?
In the threat landscape. Thank you for specifying the threat landscape as well, because I have kids. But
Yes, I feel the same.
well, I think for me is probably going back to the third party supply chain question, because like I said, people like to feel in control, and you can control what you're doing in your own company. you can't control what's happening in dozens, if not hundreds, of third parties around you. You can try, but you're probably not going to be that successful at it. So you do need to try to understand the threats and where they're going. You need to understand who your own critical third parties are, and and really kind of try to have eyes in every single corner, which is almost impossible. So those are the types of things that I feel are looming basically for us as a sector. When is that next SolarWinds? When is that next Kaseya? When is that next incident that's going to, suddenly impact a ton of our members, not just our members, but all types of private and public sector companies and agencies? And, when is that going to come? Because it's always that classic, it's not if, but when. And I think at this point we're scrambling, and you see a lot of great work from different cybersecurity centers around the world, really trying to push information assurance and best practices in the cybersecurity realm to all different types of companies. Even your, mom and pop stores, on the high street, and really being able to kind of protect people as much as possible. So I think that's where we are, not just as a sector, but as a community, really, to the cybersecurity community, to help each other out, to understand where we're interconnected, and to communicate as much as possible. And hopefully that does the trick. But in the meantime, we'll be staying vigilant and monitoring where we can.
If you look, I don't know, 3 to 5 years out, does that calculus of what are the big challenges facing cybersecurity professionals change for you at all? Do you see things like digital currencies, post-quantum computing? Like, are these kind of, are you looking down the barrel of the future and being like, that's coming down the pike, like we need to start thinking about this and worrying about it now?
Absolutely. I mean, most people talk about quantum as a way to break everything, isn't it? Everything that exists today will one day be broken in the near future. And, 6 years ago, we had an FS-ISAC member meeting where we had a wonderful quantum speaker say, in 10 years' time, you're going to have to start changing out your systems. And now we're 6 years in the future from that moment. And, we're still only initially talking about quantum. So, I think in some ways we're a little bit behind the curve, because when you think about it, you're talking about, you know, upgrading your entire environment to prevent it from being attacked from post-quantum computers. And people have already shown that these are in developments. Some are existing today. So we're going to have to do massive work in the next 4 to 5 years to get on top of this. And I think at the beginning, the classic cyber criminal is not going to have access to all that. But what happens whenever you finally do have a quantum as a service type threat actor who's selling his or hers wares because they've been able to finally develop this, and then he's selling out that type of service. So what are you going to do when that happens? And then the digital currencies is quite interesting too, because even though it's not brand new, some of the ways they're starting to use it, especially central bank digital currencies, the CBDCs, will impact how your companies, especially the financial institutions, the banks, how they do business and how they do transactions. And as a cybersecurity team, you're going to have to understand that. How is that changing? What are the new platforms? What are the new vectors that you need to pay attention to? And so you don't have to be a cryptocurrency specialist or a digital asset specialist, but you do have to understand what your company is doing and how they factor in. So then you can start monitoring for those threats. You can start looking at those threat actors, trying to attack those vectors. And you're going to have to stay on top of all that. It is brand new, and in some ways, once you get to that point, it's going to be business as usual of monitoring the threat, assessing the threat, working with your risk management team, working with your resilience teams to prepare yourselves against that potential attack. But you do first need to start understanding this technology and how your company's adopting it.
So it's a good career path.
Yeah.
Lots of Lots of opportunity, right? I mean, it's cybersecurity isn't going away anytime soon.
That's right.
All right. So thank you so much for being with us. And I know we'll have you back again soon.
Great. Well, thank you for asking me.
Since we talked about how building intelligence and cyber teams is like putting together a complex Lego set, let's leave you with a quote from Ole Kirk Christensen, the founder of Lego. Only the best is good enough. We're looking forward to a lot more great conversations with FinCyber leaders around the world. Follow the podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or FS-ISAC.com. Also, check out our Thought Leadership Hub at FS-ISAC.com/insights. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on FinCyber Today.